Hey everybody, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. Professor Bob Long here. We're going to do a continuation of the skull bones, at least the structures that my students are responsible for. Now, we learned the major bones of the skull in a previous video: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. We learned maxillary and zygomatic. And if we do a little bit of a close-up here, hopefully you can see this. We have nasal, maxillary, lacrimal, ethmoid, and then all the way back here would be the sphenoid bone. We have the vomer, that's at the bottom of the nasal cavity. We have the mandible or jawbone, and if I tilt the skull up, we have the two little palatine bones at the roof of the mouth. So I hope you can see those, okay? Now, what we need to start learning is all the landmarks. The landmarks are all the grooves and bumps and holes and ridges. There's some external landmarks and there's some internal landmarks. So I'm going to do the external ones, not all of them, but quite a few, so that we can get started learning these. I believe in doing this in several small chunks, so make sure you don't do too much in one sitting. Your brain can only absorb so much at a time. Now, one of the first things on our list of things to know, if we start off on page 16, if you're following along, is we learn the orbit. We learn all the major bones of the skull on page 16 and 17, and we even started in on the mandible on the very back. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going through some of the landmarks, but I'm not going to go in this order. If I follow the list, I'll be jumping from here to there to here, and you always get lost getting oriented. My brain works a little differently in that I like to put everything from top to bottom or front to back or left to right, and I like to group structures together and just learn those. And whenever they're related, I stick them together or come up with a funny sentence to try to remember them. So now, the first thing I want to learn is the major sutures of the skull. We know this is the orbit. Each eye socket is called an orbit. Now, all of the bones of the skull, there's over 22 bones that grow together and fuse. Where two bones fuse is one of these little suture lines. You can name any suture line simply by naming the two bones on either side of the line. For example, this suture line right here between the frontal and parietal bones is technically called the frontoparietal suture. If I look down on top of the skull, there's two parietal bones here. This is called the parieto-parietal suture. This is called the occipito-parietal suture. This is called the temporo-parietal suture. This is called the temporo-occipital suture. And every suture has a name. I have the maxillary zygomatic suture. I have all these sutures, okay? You don't need to know them all. You can put them from the names. But four of the sutures are so large and so obvious that they gave them their own names. And so if I look at the skull, if I were to cut the front of the skull off, that would be a frontal or coronal section of the skull. So when I look down on top of the skull, since that would be a coronal section, this suture that goes all the way across the top of the skull is known as the coronal suture. This one, which would divide the skull in a sagittal section, is called the sagittal suture. So I have coronal suture. We do it this way: coronal and sagittal. Now, this one that looks like an upside down V comes from the Greek letter lambda. As I said before, the Greek letter lambda looks like an upside down V. So that is called the lambdoidal suture because it looks like the Greek letter lambda. And it's the boundary between the parietal and occipital bones. So I have coronal, sagittal, lambdoidals, and if I go all the way over here, on the edges of the lambdoidal suture, there's a little suture that arches up that separates the parietal and temporal bones, and that is called the squamosal suture or squamous suture. It gets its name because our temporal bone has a rocky part and a flat part, and the flat part is called the squamous portion, the squamous region of the temporal bone. And so since this flat area right on the side of your skull here where there's some muscles is called the squamous part or squamous portion of the temporal bone, that's called the squamosal suture. So there's four sutures: coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, squamosal. And if you go around, they make a little sort of rectangle. Coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, squamosal. Coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, squamosal. The other side would have the same thing: coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, squamosal sutures. So learn those four sutures, okay? Now I'm going to go to the front of the skull, And I have a real human skull, and I refer to it as this the real one, but I mean the real model. But this real human skull and this real human skull, these are two real human skulls. Now, if I look at them, right above the orbit, there's a small hole here, but on this side it's a notch. On this guy, it's a notch on both sides, and on our plastic skull, there's a little notch there and a little notch there. So now, because on some real humans, there's a hole here because a piece of bone goes across there, an opening or a hole in a skull is called a foramen. It's F-O-R-Amen, foramen, okay? A foramen, and foramina for plural, would be any of these holes in the bone would be called a foramen. If you see a hole in a bone, that hole has something foramen as its name. The other something tells you something about which foramen you're looking at. Now, because on some real humans we have a notch on both sides, it can be called a foramen or a notch. Typically it's learned as a foramen, but some people refer to it as a notch. I want my students to learn it the way that it is here. And if you look on page 16 under frontal bone, there's a structure called the supraorbital foramen, and then in parentheses it says supraorbital notch. Okay, so that is the supraorbital foramen. Supraorbital is all one word, and it comes from the word superior. It means above the orbit, there's a little foramen there. The supraorbital foramen. Now, if I go below the orbit in the maxillary bone, there's a hole just below the orbit in either maxillary bone. If that's the supraorbital foramen, this is the infraorbital foramen. Infraorbital is all one word. Infraorbital foramen. Supraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen. Now, since we're on the maxillary bone right now, I want to talk about one other landmark. You see the little ridges above where your teeth are? The ridges in your gums, if you look at them closely in the mirror, those ridges come from the fact that when we pull a tooth, if I look on the inside of here, there's a little empty sac. A little empty air sac is called an alveolus. So, since those ridges are right above where those alveoli would be, those ridges are called alveolar processes. A process is any generalized bump that sticks out of a bone. So those are called the alveolar processes. So now, I have supraorbital foramen, infraorbital foramen, alveolar processes. Okay? Now, one other thing I want to show you while we're here is in the nasal cavity, there's several structures that come together. There's the vomer, but if I look in here, it looks like there's one complete piece of bone going all the way down. And it's actually two pieces of bone. And if I look inside the orbit, deep inside here, we learn the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid is like a block of bone. But hanging off the ethmoid is a little wedge sticking down like this. And then the vomer sticks up and joins that wedge. So there's actually two pieces of bone that wedge together. The bottom part, if I take my index finger and I rub it on the bottom, I'm rubbing the vomer. If I run my finger up, it's going to bump into another piece hanging off the ethmoid bone. And since it's hanging in a perpendicular fashion, that little piece on top is referred to as the perpendicular plate. The bottom part is the vomer, the top part is the perpendicular plate. Now, if I look inside the nasal cavity, there's a big ridge sticking off the wall here. There's another one here, and there's a little tiny one that's not visible on this skull. Each one of those three ridges sticking off the side walls here is called a nasal concha or concha. Now, the three are called the superior, the middle, and the inferior nasal concha based on superior and inferior. The only one that's on our list is this inferior nasal concha, or concha is how you should pronounce it, but it sounds funny. So, I think of this little space as a VIP room, like a very important person. You get your own room at the club or whatever. Well, the VIP are those three structures: vomer, inferior nasal concha, perpendicular plate. Vomer, inferior nasal concha, perpendicular plate on top. Okay? So far we've learned this. The four sutures: coronal, sagittal, lambdoidal, squamosal. We know the zygomatic arch from the last lab. We have the supraorbital foramen, the infraorbital foramen. We have the vomer, inferior nasal concha, and perpendicular plate. One other structure I want to show you while we're at it is if I look down, it's kind of probably hard to see. I don't know if you guys can see it, and I can't see myself on your monitor. But there's a little hole right inside there that is called the lacrimal canal or lacrimal foramen. Now, our list, if I'm going through here, we've covered the sutures in the orbit, we've covered the supraorbital foramen. If we skip down, we've covered the zygomatic arch, and then we haven't done anything else on page 16. On page 17, we've done the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. We've done the infraorbital foramen and the alveolar process of the maxillary bone. The Palatine process really is most of the roof of the mouth here. Those are called the Palatine processes until I bump into the Palatine bone. So the roof of the mouth is your Palatine process of the maxillary bone until we get to the Palatine bones. So now we've covered those three. We've done the zygomatic arch. It's listed in 2 places. Where it says lacrimal fossa, the word fossa means a shallow depression. And if you look very closely at this, the wall has a little shallow depression in it, like a little groove, and then there's the hole in the bottom. That groove is called the lacrimal fossa. And if you're in my class, I want you to take a pen or pencil and scratch off the word fossa, scratch off lacrimal fossa and put lacrimal canal. Because I want you to know the hole there, and that hole is called the lacrimal canal. That's where your tears are going to drain deep inside of there. Okay, again, I don't know if you can see that. I can see it from where I'm sitting, but I can't see what the camera is catching. All right? So those are most of the external anatomical structures that I want you to know for now. The last thing I want to do before I finish up for this is do the mandible. So I'm going to pop the mandible off the skull. Now, when we study the mandible, which is on the very last page here, it's going to be on page 18 here at the top. There's a whole bunch of structures that you need to know on the mandible. And they're not real difficult if you learn them 3 at a time. So now, if I turn the mandible sideways, this entire area from the front all the way back until it starts to jut up here, all of this is referred to as the body of the mandible. The very corner here is called the angle, because it makes a little angle. So that's the angle, body and angle. This flat part that sticks up and has these 2 bumps sticking off is called the ramus. So I have body, angle, ramus. Body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus. Okay? I'm going to look at my watch for a second. Okay? Body, angle, ramus. And repeat them till you can't stand it and touch them. Body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus, body, angle, ramus. Now, at the top of the ramus, there's 3 landmarks we need to know. This bump that's at the back, it's kind of nice and rounded. A real round, smooth bump in anatomy is called a condyle. And since this is part of the mandible, that one's called the mandibular condyle, this rounded part right here. And on our list that talks about the head of the condyle, and there is, but you can not worry about that. So if you're in my class, scratch the head of the condyle off the list. But this is called the mandibular condyle, or sometimes it's called the condylar process of the mandible. You can say mandibular condyle, okay? The one in front is called the coronoid process. Coronal is frontal, and that's the coronoid process. And the groove between them that makes the little notch is called the mandibular notch. So learn those 3 things. Mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Or you can say condylar process, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Repeat them till you can't stand it, and then do the next, go back to the beginning. Body, angle, ramus, mandibular condyle, coronoid process, mandibular notch. Now, the ridges that the teeth are set in are called the alveolar processes. They're called the same thing here as they are here. They're called alveolar processes, those little bumps. So if we ask you to identify the bumps or ridges, alveolar processes. Now, the tip of your chin that sticks out is called the mental protuberance. To protrude means to stick out. And mentis and mentar means to think. So when we think, we tend to touch our chin like, So we call this the mental protuberance. It's not on the list, but on either side of the mental protuberance, there's a little hole or opening right there that some nerves come out in blood vessels that feed our gums. That is called the mental foramen. So the mental foramen is here. If I look inside the mandible, I have to look at the back side of the ramus. It looks like someone tried to poke a hole there. And on a real human skull, it is a hole, but you can't see it very well. It's not poked all the way through, but there's some nerves that come out here and feed your gums back here. And that is called the mandibular foramen. So we have the mental foramen on the outside and the mandibular foramen on either side, on the back side of the ramus. So you should know this: body, angle, ramus, mandibular condyle, cornoid process, mandibular notch. Alveolar process, mental foramen, mandibular foramen. Alveolar process, mental foramen, mandibular foramen. Alveolar process, mental foramen, mandibular foramen. That's how you should be studying this, is by studying just 3 or 4 things for the whole skull, and then you'll learn it all if you do it in small chunks, repeat it. Now watch. I want to show you something. Let's do the whole mandible together. The bone is called, if we ask you to ID the entire bone, mandible. Body, angle, ramus, mandibular condyle, cornoid process, mandibular notch. Alveolar process, mental foramen, and mandibular foramen. That's the whole thing. We learned 10 structures in exactly 4 minutes. And if you know the entire mandible now, it takes about 4 to 7 minutes to learn 10 or 12 structures simply by breaking them in smaller chunks and repeating them. So if you know this, if I ask you, ID the part, 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 body, angle, ramus, mandibular condyle, cornoid process, mandibular notch, ID the ridges, alveolar process, ID the hole or opening, mental foramen, ID the hole or opening, mandibular foramen. If you know all of that in less than 4 minutes, then you can begin to learn the rest of the skull. So in a short period of time, through repetition, repeating things in the same order, hopefully you're going to learn all of this. Anyway, I hope you had as much fun as I did. We have a lot more to do in the skull. So I'll see you in the next video. Do this till you can't stand it. Do it till you understand it. Do it till you can teach it to someone else without looking at your list. And you'll be ready for an A on the test. Thanks for watching. See you soon.